three of which you're going to hear about today, because of our 6 sites, we had the amazing fortune to have 3 of them burn in a single set of events late this summer. So that is obviously kind of the impetus for today's open house. We also have sites that didn't burn. We have the Bodega Marine Reserve out on the coast. We have the Lassen Field Station in partnership with Lassen Volcanic National Park. And we have the Jepson Prairie Reserve, which is down south of Dixon, and a partnership with the Solano Land Trust. So we have other sites that didn't burn. But regardless of the fires, one message that we really want to get across strongly is that in spite of the fires, in spite of COVID, we've been able to keep our doors open to research of all kinds through this period. And really one of our hopes for today is that we can maybe jar some thinking and inspire some potential research projects in the future, questions that could grow out of these obviously changing conditions that we have in our landscapes that surround us. So we are going to have 3 short presentations by the directors of the 3 reserves that were affected by fires this go around. And after that, we'll have a very brief roundup by Professor Andrew Latimer about research initiatives that are already underway as a follow-up to those fires, so that we can give people an idea of what people are interested in and looking at, and maybe also what kind of data are going to be available for other people to build upon as we move forward. We intend to leave plenty of time for questions at the end. We actually hope to be done in about 35-40 minutes with the presentation thing. And then we can move on to some kind of hopefully freewheeling discussion. So if anybody doesn't if no one has any kind of procedural questions before we get started, I think we can go ahead and just launch into this. And our first presentation is going to be about Stebbins Cold Canyon. And Sarah Oktay, who's been with us for, many of you know because she's been with us maybe 2.5, 3 years, almost 3 years at this point, is going to be making that presentation for us. Sarah?
Thank you so much. And I am recording this and will be sharing the recording with anyone that would like to have it. So get this started. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay, great.
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, here is an image of our beloved Stebbins Cold Canyon Reserve. I'll tell you a little bit of basics about Stebbins Cold Canyon and then show you some pictures and some overlays of what the latest burn has done to the landscape, and remind everyone about how quickly we rebounded after the 2015 fire, which was also very extensive, and then finish it up very quickly with a couple of research projects. I am assuming many of you know where you're at and where we're at, but if not, here is a big map that shows the Sacramento region, the various counties that complicate matters in management of a reserve. We have Solano County, Yolo County, and Napa County, and Stebbins Cold Canyon is right on the border of all of these canyons. Here on this picture, you see the 3 reserves we'll be speaking about today. Stebbins Cold Canyon, here right along 128, almost in the dead center of this picture. Quail Ridge Reserve, a much bigger reserve directly to the west. Lake Berryessa, and then if you keep looking north, you'll see McLaughlin Natural Reserve, which is a large reserve toward the north. So today I'll be speaking just briefly about Stebbins Cold Canyon, and there will be a couple of parts of this that will mention the Cahill Riparian Preserve, which is right near us and also burned fairly extensively right along Puda Creek. And of course, many of you have helped out in repairs after the 2015 RAG fire. We've got a picture of the many volunteers that make a huge difference in our trail repairs here in the upper left-hand corner after the 2015 fire. Students studying in the riparian corridor, and an article from the New York Times about the rebirth after 2015. So Stebbins Cold Canyon is a partnership for ecological integrity. It's about 640 acres. Everything here in blue is university owned. And in this lower left-hand corner, you see the portion that is the Cahill Riparian Preserve, but everything here in blue, and you can see the trail right there in the center. That includes the Blue Ridge Trail, the Homestead Trail, and Annie's Loop. And Lake Berryessa is right along here. And we have partners that include the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife and the Bureau of Land Management. Of course, we are known for our trails, and this has been a chaotic year with COVID. We shut down for quite some time for COVID. Our trails are shut down right now because of the burn, because we have extensive damage, which you'll see. We're working very hard to clear these trails, and by we, I mean Paul and all the volunteers are working very hard to get these trails cleared and safe. But we have our large trail here, which is the Blue Ridge Loop Trail, a strenuous, difficult trail. This is the most popular trail, by the way, between Sacramento and San Francisco, as you'll find out. And then Annie's Trail, which Tuliumi is a big partner on and owns some of the property that it overlays, is in the rear there. So Stebbins, as you know, if you've been fortunate enough to go out there, is a very steep area with steep terrain that includes both wet and dry features and north and different facing slopes with different drainages. We're known for beautiful chamise, chaparral, and in fact, we've been doing research on the chamise and chaparral and changes in that along the slope side relative to drought. And a very wet riparian woodland center feature there with the creek down the center, which can be several feet deep at high. This is actually March of this year of 2020, if you all can recall back that far. So we have a high public use, as I've mentioned. I've got a lot of different pictures here of our many volunteers and of people going on walks. We've just started earlier this year a docent program training about 12 to 15 docents to take people on guided walks to learn more about the landscape. We have to endure a lot of helicopter rescues for heat-related illnesses. I have a long list here of all of our partners, but the big take-home for this slide is we have 65,000 people who visit each year. So up to 1,000 people right after COVID started, we had 1,200 to 1,500 a day. We've got all kinds of exciting research that was going on before the fires, and including moth research, research into spiders, looking at toxins in Pacific newts, looking at drought pollution, at toyans. We're part of many statewide projects where people are collecting samples of everything from big leaf maples to spiders and newts. Here is the beginning of our of the fire, at least for Stebbins Cold Canyon. Of course, there was the big lightning event. The LNU Lightning Complex Fire was started after many lightning strikes occurred around the state, which Shane will talk about more. This is actually part of the fire that was started on the Stebbins entrance here on August 18th. This is a view a few days later, actually August 18th at 2300 hours. This is one of many of the alert wildfire spotting cameras. This is one that's located at Mount Vacaville, looking back toward Stebbins and toward Quail Ridge. Here is a recent map. It's a little fuzzy, but a recent map that Cathy provided for me from the fire overlays that shows the extent, the perimeter of the LNU Lightning Complex Fire. And you can see this fire completely encircled Lake Berryessa and had a much farther range than previous fires. And underneath all of this, of course, is our reserves. Underneath here, you can see a burn severity chart on the right that shows how severely low vegetation burned using Landsat imagery. On the left, we have a reflective full color image from a satellite showing the reflection of the fires and the smoke there. So that is both a actual visual image along with some hyperspectral overlays. Here is from David Ackerley with Mark Koshowski, who's on the call. Was kind enough to overlay this imagery for south side of Puda Canyon that shows very extensive burns, a big change in our vegetation profile, which will be obvious when you look at Google Earth. So this is a recent Google Earth image. Normally this would all be green or relatively green. So Stebbins in 2020 pretty much completely burned, and it also burned broadly in the 2015 rag fire. This is the 2020 pictures showing one of our new kiosks, which completely burned out, but we can still repaint it and reuse it. And Dr. Bill Pevick, who's here in the audience and has done a lot of great work clearing the trails for us. Here's some examples of how it looked back in 2015 and how quickly it did recover with the help of many volunteers. You all might be interested in Robin Carlson's blog, Wildfire to Wildflowers, that shows how Stebbins recovered over time. It's beautiful. This is our 2020 impact. So this is pictures from just last week when I did a walk around. You can see burn holes from where roots actually of these large blue oaks burned underneath the ground. We've got a lot of steps missing, wooden steps. And in some cases, it looked like the fire actually flowed like a river. Some of our signs recovered or survived, and we just have to see if the plants come up around it. You can also go to our YouTube channel. There's a UC Davis Natural Reserve System YouTube channel with 2 excellent wildlife camera montages that Paul Haveman made that show exactly what it looked like. Our restoration work includes everything that you see on this map here. This is the whole trail system and basically a list of to-do items for us as far as restoration, putting in erosion control systems, putting in some waddling and trying to control what water does when it starts raining again. We have a lot of replacements we have to do for signage and wayfinding too. So basically protecting the sediment flow and trying to control rain. So immediate and recurring research, and I'm almost out of time, so I'll go through this very quickly. This is a list of all of the different projects that are starting at either Stebbins or at Quail or at McLaughlin, a range of UC Davis scientists, including Randy Dahlgren, Andrew Latimer, David Ackerley's with UC Berkeley. We're looking at mainly what's happening to the soil, what's happening with hydrophobicity, compaction, runoff, soil chemistry, and what's occurring as this material sloughs off into these creeks and how that changes the water chemistry. And I'll finish up on this slide, which is some possible research questions that we might want you to consider today. And I think Andrew is going to talk a little bit more about this, but obviously we're concerned about water quality. Obviously, we're very concerned about erosion. And in fact, the USGS is doing a lot of work looking at what's going to happen as far as landslides and water movement into the system, how that's going to affect water absorption. We're looking at fuel loading and fire frequency. This is now a landscape that's burned twice in the last 5 years. So how quickly does it recover? What kind of issues we might have with invasive plants and fire? And how does this affect disease ecology like Lyme and tick disease?
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. I'll ask you to hold questions to the end so we can blast through these presentations. Next, we're going to have Shane Waddell, the director of Quail Ridge Reserve, present on the dramatic turn that things took at Quail Ridge this August.
Start again with actually my voice. Thanks, Jeffrey. For those of you that know the site, this is the main entrance to the reserve shortly after it burned. Okay, I can't move the, there we go. For those of you that don't know the site, we've already seen this map once. The Quail Ridge Reserve is about 2,500 acres located on the southern edge of Lake Berryessa, the peninsula closest to the dam that juts out into the lake. It is a partnership reserve as far as ownership goes. We have this variety of owners of property. However, the university does manage the entire reserve, which encompasses most of the peninsula. The most dominant feature of the reserve is the extreme topography and the associated road system that gets you around the area. The habitats of the site are representative inner Coast Range California habitats, including oak woodlands, mixed oak forests, chaparral communities, including the flowering chamise on the right there, grasslands, and riparian corridors. So the research on the reserve is diverse. We've had everything from wireless network research to frog studies, grass, oak, you name it. We're not exclusive to biological sciences. We're open to any kind of research. And there's a diverse array of historic projects and accompanying data. So fire in the landscape. Historically, the reserve has been spared from most of these large regional fires. The map on the right depicts this. It's a little dated. It doesn't have the last couple fires. You can see on the left, the 2018 county fire burned the entire eastern shore of Lake Berryessa. And as you can see on the map, that comes pretty close to the reserve. Luckily, the wind was blowing to the north. So it just burned right down to the water's edge and the peninsula was saved. We've only had one significant fire in the last 30 years in 2005. That was only about 200 acres that started from the lake from a boater. However, we've seen in the area the frequency of fires and the scale increasing. And in fact, the reserve has been evacuated 5 of the last 6 years. Here is a side-by-side images of the reserve pre-fire and post-fire. These are both color photographs. Unfortunately, the one on the right is mostly gray. There are a few patches of green there that shows you that some of the canopy did survive, but this is to show you that the understory of the entire peninsula did burn. So what's the story? So on August 15th, there were about 12,000 lightning strikes throughout California, causing about 560 fires, probably more, but those were the kind of significant ones. Some of those blew up into very large fires, some of the biggest in California history. What we're seeing here is the Hennessy fire that started about 20 miles away due west of the reserve. The western side has always been the side I've been concerned about because the winds tend to blow the fires towards the reserve from that direction, and it hadn't been burned. At least the peninsula adjacent to us hadn't burned yet. So, but at this point, 1240, it was business as usual. I was at the field station doing work, wasn't too concerned. However, by 6:30, the power was out. The fire had jumped onto the peninsula next to us. My family was evacuated. That was partially because the power was out and it was a hot night and it was pretty uncomfortable. The kids wanted to be able to sleep that night. Still, we weren't overly concerned. We'd been, used to evacuating. The difference in this fire and many of the other recent fires is there were so many fires going on that CAL FIRE resources were very limited. In fact, this entire day, we didn't see helicopters fighting this fire. We didn't see the planes dropping retardant on this fire. We didn't see many ground crews. They were out there. They were just stretched so thin that we didn't see them. So this is kind of chronicling what I witnessed leading up to the evacuation. So this is where it finally peaked onto the ridgetop on the adjacent peninsula. It extending along that ridgetop. As it gets into the evening, extending even further. And here's where it just starts to descend down towards the canyon, and the Pleasure Cove Marina is located directly beneath this. And at this point, about 9 o'clock, I called it quits. Went back to my house, threw in the remaining things that I could fit in my truck, and headed out. There was one last thing I wanted to grab from the field station, so I zipped around to head up. But when I got to the front gate, this is what I saw. The fire racing up the ridge line that would lead to the corp yard and eventually to my house. So at that point, I called all the neighbors and said, okay, time to go, and got everybody that I knew evacuated out of there. And this is why. This is the result about a week later when we finally got access to the site to assess damage. You can see it burned extensively. It was very jarring. The corp yard and the loss of our longtime reserve truck. Unfortunately, the director's residence, my house, didn't survive. for whatever reason, my kids' little play structure did, and that will be moving to Davis shortly. Our tent cabins, you can see the structures, the skeletons of the cots underneath. So all 8 tent cabins burned in this fire. Our laboratory trailer is nothing but a foundation at this point. And we had extensive damage to research equipment throughout the peninsula. On the left, part of our wireless network and one of our automated animal tracking sites. On the right, this was our mesocosm for looking at climate change effects on dragonfly. Fortunately, it was done for the season and it was just stored. So we got the data and we didn't lose anything from that project. This is a look from one of the tent cabin sites to the north and looking at the damage throughout and looking up onto the ridgetop from Decker Canyon. You can see this was one of the hot spots that did burn. The upper slopes to the left side were chamise covered. So that was a thick canopy that looks like the surface of the moon at this point. But there is hope. This is my house, one of my tulips emerging out of the wreckage. You know, fire in this area is supposed to be a natural part of the life cycle. CAL FIRE and different practices have meant that a lot of the reserve hadn't been burned in 100 years. That's far too long for this habitat to not burn. And so we've got a fairly extensive burn. Even the most barren slopes though, these chamise covered slopes that look like the moon will resprout. They'll bounce back in 2 to 3 years and be fairly lush again. And some of these wet drainages are providing a little sanctuary to the wildlife that did survive the fire. And we have some facilities. The studio survived. While we didn't have the helicopters and we didn't see a lot of crews, a crew did get in here and defended the researcher house and the studio and one of my neighbors that did survive as well. The field station was built for fire. It's got cement board siding, metal roofs, paint, fire resistant paints, and it pretty much was unscarred throughout. So what's the status of quail today? So the reserve is open to research. The roads are clear, the gators are operational. Like I said, the field station, the research house, and the studio are all available. We are still under COVID restrictions, but we are open for day use and some limited overnight use. Next steps, our staff are preparing for the rain season, doing some revetment work, trying to prevent landslides and keep our road system intact. There'll be continued cleanup. And then we're going to target rebuilding those tent cabins, not only for the future when classes start coming out again, but they're also a way to COVIDly isolate researchers that do want to stay overnight. In the future, we will build a director's residence again. We don't know the time scale for that. A laboratory trailer replacement is in store. We're going to want some feedback from researchers in our user community to tell us what they want as far as in terms of laboratory space and in terms of research infrastructure, including the wireless networks. We're looking for ideas on what you want and what you want to see the Quail Ridge Reserve evolve into in this next generation. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shane. And finally, we have Cathy. Where are you, Cathy? I need to look at you there. Cathy Koehler, the director up at McLaughlin Reserve in Lake County. Make sure you put yourself off of mute before you get started.
Okay, can you hear me? Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, cool. As you know, I'm Cathy Koehler. I am the site director of UC Davis's McLaughlin Reserve, which is a 7,000 acre reserve surrounded by thousands of acres of public land. And we have a field station and other support facilities for researchers, instructors working at McLaughlin or in the landscape, none of which were affected by the fire, thankfully. And so we've been working with researchers during COVID times to be able to accommodate their research activity in COVID safe ways, and we will continue to do that. What I'm trying to do with this slide, though, is draw your attention to the fact that the landscape of the reserve is very heterogeneous. What this slide is providing you is it's showing from a very fine scale the diversity in chemical signals of different geologic substrates, all the way up to an intermediate scale, which shows you various geologic substrates, and to a landscape scale, which shows you that the landscape is comprised of various geologic substrates. And so in this area where we have a Mediterranean climate that's hot and dry in the summertime, the plants have to deal very intimately with the characteristics of the geology. And what this geologic heterogeneity results in is extreme heterogeneity in plant communities, which comes together as extreme biodiversity in this region. And so on the sedimentary soils that we have to the other reserves that you've heard about, we have oak woodland, grasslands, chemise chaparral, mixed chaparral. But then we have also these serpentinites, which are chemically radically different from the normal soils that most human beings are used to. And they support in our area serpentine chaparral and serpentine meadow systems. And we have sharp lines interfacing between all of these different plant communities, which gives you this amazing mosaic paint by number look to the landscape. Now, with the fires, we have this added layer of heterogeneity into the landscape. In 2015, we experienced the Rocky and Jerusalem fires in July and August, and they burned about a half of the reserve, primarily serpentine chaparral, less so oak woodland. Then in August of 2020, we had the LNU complex, and it burned about half of the reserve, primarily oak woodland, less so serpentine chaparral. And so you have this mosaic of burn across this landscape. So I went to Google Earth and I wanted to see how well we could look at layers of fire using the amazing historic layers that Google Earth provides. So on the left-hand side, we have a not 2015 fire view. Upper right-hand, we have the spring following the 2015 fires. And in the lower right hand, we have a little less detail, but still awesome to have, a post LNU fire layer. What I did is I went in and comparing to the pre-fire, I was able to put in a very precise line showing where the fire and unburnt, between the fire and unburnt vegetation. So we have patches of unburnt vegetation within burnt areas and patches of unburnt vegetation flanked by burnt. I did the same thing for the 2020 fires. This red line is kind of boldly separating burnt stuff from less so burnt stuff. But in the less so burnt stuff, it's a little less clear what's going on. I could see from these aerial photographs that there was burning activity in this area, but it's still green. So there's something we need to go in ground truth here to really understand what's happening. But what this allows me to do is definitively give generations of burns and layering effects. So I can see what burnt in 2015 and not subsequently. I can see what burnt in 2020 and not before. I can see what burnt in both fires, and I can see that there are spots that didn't burn at all. And if you go to the land, this is what you're looking at, for example. What we have here is in the background, we have a Sargent cypress, McNabb cypress, whiteleaf manzanita mixed grove, and it did not burn in either 15 or 20. And then coming into the foreground, you see the re-sprouting stubble of the species that, of the community that burned in 2015. And so we have species here that sprout from the roots, like the leather oak or silk tassel bushes. But then we also have species like the cypress species and that whiteleaf manzanita that are seed obligate reproducers. They don't resprout, they have to come back as seedlings. And in this view, you can see how the fire moved in and burnt some of that stuff that had burnt in 2015, and back here, some of the stuff that didn't burn in 2015, and so freshly burned in 2020. So thinking about those Sargent cypress, which are seed obligate sprouters, if I consider this grove right here, which did not burn in 2015, this grove did burn in 2020. And After the burn, these serotinous cones open up and they just shed this rain of seeds onto the ground. So once we have rains and we have germinating conditions, we should have a little mini forest of a crowd of Sargent cypress, McNabb cypress seedlings on the ground here. Unfortunately, as is demonstrated in this pair of slides, this cypress grove, which did burn in 2015 and had this great mass of seedlings on the ground, it burned in 2020 as well. And so what we have is a big question mark in the sky. Like, what is a healthy fire interval for the communities at the McLaughlin Reserve? Do some have a fire interval response that is different from other communities? What happens to these communities that comprise primarily resprouters? Are they going to be able to survive and reconstitute themselves? Is there any seed bank here? So that's a big question mark. Another thing that I've observed in both fires is that there are patches of vegetation which seem remarkably resistant to fire. It was very evident in 2015, but we still saw it again in 2020. The upper left hand illustrates to you that the fire came in this direction and it started to burn this manzanita line before you hit this Sargent cypress back here. And so the forefront, the first few members of that clump, of that area burned, but then behind it, you see that the rest of the manzanita didn't burn. And so you have these nice red barked manzanitas. They got a little heat singed, but they're still alive. And somehow or other, they resisted burning. And after 2015, this is a black and white photograph from after the 2015 fire layer from Google Earth. And the light colored layers are not burned shrub patches. And you can see how the fire moved in and it stopped and it moved around. Why did the fire move around these patches? Was it just geographically where these shrub patches were located that they didn't burn? Was it something to do with the species? Are these species somehow resistant to fire, even though we label them as fire followers? And there's some interesting information coming out of France where they're asking the same question about their cypress forests, and they're actually finding that their cypress don't burn all that well. And so I'm wondering if that's the case for ours. I think it is. Is it something to do with the age of the plant community? Do young plant communities burn more readily once they get past a certain age of resprouting than do more mature old growth plant communities? I don't know the answer to these questions. The other thing that I wanted to introduce to you to was the fact that we do use fire on the landscape here at McLaughlin for some of our management. We've been doing grassland management primarily in the serpentine grasslands. And one of the first approaches that we've always had is before you start managing the grassland or with a vision for managing forward, you start with a prescribed burn. And that just removes a lot of that annual grass for that first attempt at restoration. And you can also do it mechanically. Here's a research plot where a researcher was studying how the plant community recovers if you remove the invasive species, the grass species here. And you can see that the wildflowers, which are the primary constituents of these communities, respond in the very first year after you remove the grass seedlings in the spring. And we've been managing this meadow for about 10 years. And you can see from this July shot of just at the beginning of our management to this August shot very recently, this is the same meadow system. We're not calling it grasslands anymore, we're calling them serpentine meadows, because they comprise primarily forbs, wildflowers, and there is a grass component, but it's a very different beast than it was when it was invaded. And my point with this is that I would speculate that these restored meadows are going to burn very differently. These native dominated meadows are going to burn very differently than the invaded ones. And a point in fact is the upper right-hand slide here is showing you a control burn that we were doing in your typical non-native invaded annual grassland associated with oak understory and savanna. And the flames are pretty big. Down here in the lower left, this is not a control burn. This is the natural burn of 2015 through one of our restored meadows. And you can't even see the flames on the edge. They burn very differently. And so I'm hoping moving forward that at McLaughlin, we can actually start studying how fire can be used in the system to restore native to restore native vegetation, pre-European fire cycles, and understand how restoration may be a solution to trying to moderate our fires. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cathy. So at this point, we're going to turn it over to our illustrious leader, Professor Andrew Latimer of Plant Sciences. Andrew?
Ooh, I better unmute. Hey, guys. Hey, it's great to see so many people here. Thanks so much for coming. This is great. Great and varied group of people. I'm really excited to get a chance to talk to you. Yeah, let me just tell you, those 3 presentations did a really great job of showing kind of what happened out there, these reserves, what it meant for our infrastructure, and some ideas for things to do next. I'm just going to follow that up with a little bit on kind of some of the work that, survey work that I've been involved in, starting across a bunch of the reserves that burned, and then throw out some ideas, and then we can start talking. So as Cathy was just showing at a really fine scale up at McLaughlin, there's this real heterogeneity of fire history around this area. This shows the LNU Complex Fire in yellow, which is kind of our local fire this time. And overlaying over a bunch of patchwork of time since fire, or other fires that burned at different times, with the color of the patch showing roughly how long ago it was. So you can immediately see that a lot of these areas have burned multiple times and burned recently, whereas there are other parts of the region that hadn't burned. At least there's no record of them burning in at least since about the mid 20th century. So got a whole bunch of different patterns of fire history and fire intensity as well, which I think makes for a really potentially interesting kind of landscape for studying what are the effects of climate change going to be on the ecosystems acting through changing fire regimes. Yeah, and so what we're doing, so one of the things that we immediately started, people in the reserve system across a bunch of different campuses. So the UC Natural Reserve System encompasses 41 reserves across all of the UC campuses. And the reserves from 3 local UCs, UC Davis, UC Santa Cruz, and UC Berkeley, some of their reserves burned in this big lightning event and wind events this summer. So we got together and were able to get some money from the Moore Foundation to do a quick post-fire survey, and hopefully paired with a follow-up in the spring to look at what's coming back. But to go to 6 of the different reserves that just burned in these fires and do some comparisons between burned and unburned areas, and look at a whole bunch of different responses, including not just vegetation, but mammals, birds, pitfall traps for insects, and some other things, malaise traps, and some also larger scale sampling using drones. And one of the things that's nice about this is that it's somewhat rare, at least it has been rare, to get large scale fire occurring across this large gradient all the way from the coast to the inland edge of the Coast Range, from a kind of really, so there's the oceanic influenced climate to the dry valley climate. So we hope that'll be interesting to look at similar vegetation types across that gradient and how they're responding. And we're definitely open. This is somewhat question-driven science, as I hope I can convince you, but also it's also sort of speculative. We're going out and seeing what's happening. We'd be very open to people's suggestions of other things we should look at, or if you'd like to look at stuff in conjunction with this or separately, or if you'd be interested in picking up any of the sampling long-term, it's all available. It's going to be available to you, the data from this. So yeah, some of the questions that we wanted to be able to address using data like this include hydrology and water quality, looking at infiltration and different levels of fire intensity across different vegetation types, different slopes, and so on. Looking at the plants, the impact of the fire on vegetation, and then looking again back in the spring at what's growing back. what the mortality rates in particular. We're especially interested in blue oaks because they've been hit pretty hard in previous fires, and we're interested in their resilience, and other oaks, and also redwoods closer to the coast. But yeah, also we're anchoring these plots around a circular plot that we do vegetation surveys in, and there's also associated bird surveys, mammal trapping, pitfall insect trapping, some other insect trapping, and soil study, as well as doing drone overflights. So we're also interested in this question about how fuel builds up after fire, and to be able to look at that directly and have some good field observations on which species are how resilient different species are. And then in particular, if you just consider them as fuel, how quickly is fuel building up, and fuel continuity, so that a fire would be able to go through these areas again. And so that's a real interesting, I think, an important concern as fires become more prevalent again in the Coast Range. Thinking about, well, if the area around you burned, how soon would it carry a fire again? How soon do you have to worry about that? And then ideally, we'd like to be able to take these kind of intricate measurements that we take, well, they're not particularly intricate, but these time-consuming measurements of fuels on site, and scale those up to be able to say things across a whole landscape and even the region. So that's where we'd like to connect these plots to remote sensing. But yeah, that's just a few things. We're making some observations. There's many other kinds of questions. Just to throw out a few, maybe as conversation starters, there isn't a lot of information yet on carbon fluxes in shrubland landscapes in California, chaparral landscapes, even though that they're very extensive and hold a lot of carbon and then emit a bunch when they burn. Fire risk, as I was mentioning, working with indigenous peoples to manage the land or incorporate management practices, or to work with people to use the resources, culture resources that are available immediately after fire at these sites. And then we're also particularly interested in certain species and whether they're vulnerable. As Cathy mentioned, the McNabb cypress, I mentioned blue oaks, but we'd also be interested in ticks and other disease vectors and how their abundance changes after fire. Yeah, among many other things. And also really would be interested in how people respond to these landscapes. It's can be quite, make a big impact on you to walk through a landscape right after it's burned, and in a different way when you come back in the spring and it's bright green. And so you kind of get this really firsthand visceral sense of kind of ecology in fast motion. And so we'd be interested in surveying people who, as they come back, but well, many of you know much more about these topics than I do. So let me just open it up. Thank you very much for being here, and love to hear any questions that you have, or if you want to kick around suggestions or ideas, this would be great. And if we don't get to your question or you don't get to ask it, please feel free to, please do email or call me or Jeffrey or one of the other reserve directors.
I would add, we will follow up this meeting to the participants that we have a record of with just an email that includes our contact information so that you can all get to us. We can try, for those of you who have questions, we can try various hand raising methods, either raising your hand on the screen, or if you click that participant button at the bottom, it'll pull up a sidebar at which you can select a raise hand function, and we'll try to identify and call on you if you have a question for any of the people who presented.
Or you can stick things in chat. Did Jeffrey just say that already?
No, I did not.
We could open up the chat.
So we have questions from Rebecca Ann Nelson and John Williams.
Okay.
Rebecca, why don't you go first?
Hi, yeah, thank you for presenting. This is really informative and super interesting in terms of thinking about research ideas. And we've had like a couple short follow-up questions. I was like curious for Andrew, when you mentioned the like post-fire surveying, if there's like some sort of component of looking at plant functional traits at all, or trying to understand how certain functional traits for either plants or potentially other taxa might be sort of doing better or worse in response to like post-fire regeneration.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Becca. I think we don't actually have that in the protocol. I mean, we will be looking at, which plant functional types are coming back in their cover. We're kind of wrangling about how much species specific counting or cover estimation we're going to do. Thanks to people, including Susan, there's a lot of functional trait information so that if we know which species are coming back, we could trace those to patterns. There would certainly be, if you'd be interested in working with us to collect any trait data, or if we can collect samples for you, as the field crew is out there, they could potentially collect samples. We should talk about that.
Thank you. That sounds really great. Yeah, I'd be definitely potentially interested in talking further. And then, yeah, I also just had a quick question about whether, like, just to any of you, whether you think that the fire will affect bee nesting conditions, and if so, how?
We have a lot of bee work ongoing at Stebbins, so that might be one of the first places we see is some of the extensive bee colonies, how quickly, especially the ground hole digging bees, how quickly they recover.
Might look into John Mola's work after the 2015 fires. A lot of the places where he was doing his work, they burnt. And so he may have some insights on how that affected nesting behavior.
I think we had Jonathan next, is that right? And then we have Ethan and Jocelyn have their hands up as on deck.
Me, is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, Andrew, I think you are familiar with Hugh's work. I'm working with him on the prescribed burn monitoring program in California. Most of our stuff is in the Sierras, but opportunity to work in the chaparral would be great. As far as looking at fuel loading, is there anything akin to a common stand exam plot that exists in any of the reserves, sort of to get the pre-fire component? Do you know?
That's really interesting. I don't think we have that in chaparral or grassland. So no, I mean, in this survey, we're basically doing the old pair the plot with a nearby similar area, but we don't have the before and after. It'd be really interesting. I mean, that could be a good motivator to do some prescribed burning.
Yeah, and it's not required by any stretch. I mean, we could do, as you say, we could do comparing, places that burn with others that haven't. Just wondering, and we can start de novo here, sort of with this fire, is sort of ground zero too. But
yeah, the intention of these plots is they're fairly similar to a common stand. They're sort of derivative of a common stand exam plot, kind of shrunk a little bit and minus some of the tree measurements.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah, we should talk more about that. That'd be.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. That would be great.
think Ethan will be next, and I think we want to mention to people too that we're thinking about doing a short workshop with people who want to be involved further on in actual collaborative research projects. So expect an email from us giving some possible dates to get together and talk. We only have a few moments for questions, but I don't want you to be discouraged and think that we're just giving you this information and not including some long-term collaborations. The next person whose hand is up that I see is Ethan.
Cool. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. So I'm a prospective student at UC Davis, currently a master's candidate at Northern Arizona University. And I am looking at plant functional response to a burn severity gradient currently. So that's kind of the direction I'm looking to be researching in the future. And I've kind of been in contact with Jennifer Funk and Hugh Safford about doing some work on fire effects on invasion and post-fire invasive control. So looking at some seed bank composition from like a plant functional trait perspective, and then linking above and below ground traits to like disturbance response and invasion, and then community response of traits that are linked to invasion resistance. So it sounded like from a couple of your presentations, there might be some room on a couple of these reserves for that kind of work. But I'm just wondering about potential funding opportunities as an incoming grad student, if there would be potential to fund a PhD student, either through like some mixed funding or some of the agencies that participate with the reserve system. I guess it's an open question to anybody, really.
Well, I can tackle that a little bit, Ethan, and then turn it over to anyone else. Yeah, thanks. That sounds really, that sounds like great research. I'd like be interested to talk to you more about those questions. And yes, the reserves would definitely be open for those kind of studies. Yeah, is there funding? Yeah, there's definitely funding, you know, for research expenses and travel, and, you know, to be able to stay. It's pretty cheap to stay at reserves. You could definitely do that. As far as student support, then we need kind of like to look for bigger sources. And yeah, we have had some funding through BLM, Bureau of Land Management, because we partner with them on, there's a national monument kind of adjacent to Stebbins Cold Canyon. But I'm not sure what else. I'd be happy to talk to you more, try to identify sources.
Awesome. Cool. Well, yeah, thank you very much.
Hey, Jocelyn. Oh, go ahead.
Opportunities through CAL FIRE that you might look into. They've got a number of grant requests for proposals out at different times during the year that might be able to contribute.
Okay, cool. I talked to Hugh and he said that things are a little dry right now because of cap and trade deficiencies, but yeah, I'm sure there are plenty of those.
Yeah, but it hopefully will get better again.
Okay, cool.
Thanks, Ethan. Jocelyn?
Yes, hi. Thank you for presenting, everybody. This was very informative. I enjoyed participating and watching. So, Sarah, in your presentation, you had the slide about the prospective research questions. The one about the invasive plants stood out to me, and I'm just wondering, have we in the past researched how heat scarification influences seeds specifically of invasive plants to see if it enhances germination or decreases amount of seeds that germinate? And then I guess following up on that and then seeing how that translates years later post-fire. Has any research like that been done yet?
I'll probably throw some of this to Jeffrey and Andrew, but the good thing is we do have extensive seed collections from Puda Creek and from the Arboretum, from Miles DePrado and Brian Keeley. So the nice thing is they've been collecting a lot of seeds that we could use for restoration work. And we've had monitoring and surveys as to invasive plant distribution at both Quail and Stebbins that Paul Haveman has done quite extensively. So we have an idea of where invasive plants were before and where they might be seeding new areas. So, and we know where they're not.
We have Susan Harrison on this call, so I would put her on the spot and say, give us an answer or tell us who we must go to find this answer, if she is available to tell us that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't come here prepared to be useful. Didn't think about that for a while. I don't know of any general patterns that way. I mean, it seems like the big story with invasives is, of course, the opening up of the canopy and the creation of great, niche opportunities after they germinate. But whether there's any kind of broad generalizations about, or even narrow generalizations about different germination behavior, I'm not aware of that. Maybe there is, but I don't know. Sounds like somebody had better investigate.
Yes. Yeah, I've heard, I guess read in the past about how areas with higher levels of disturbance are more conducive to invasives colonizing an area. But I'm just wondering if, I guess, the impacts on both the seeds themselves and the soil would potentially hinder that. I do have one more question. I'm just wondering, in the past, have we looked at how species diversity compares between similar vegetation stands that have different frequency or different fire intervals?
Andrew, you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. And yes, there has been. And I think the answer depends a lot on which vegetation type we're talking about. So grassland, the annual grasslands around here, I think Susan's work shows that pretty much after about 3 years after a fire, it sort of reverts to what it had been before. So even pretty frequent fire, it will have a big impact on species composition and diversity levels right after the fire, particularly the composition, which species are there and which aren't as prevalent, but then it quickly bounces back. In Chaparral, there's kind of well, there's a lot of research that's been done in general on different sort of reproductive strategies. And some of it, the upshot is that species that rely on seeds, rely on serotiny, like seeds held in the canopy to regenerate after fire, are pretty sensitive to fire at interval because they don't have a persistent seed bank. And if they don't mature in between fires, then their population can crash. That's just a couple of examples. I mean, in the forests, like Sierra forests, there's kind of a general pattern where more frequent fire tends to favor pine, some species of trees, including pines that have thick bark and are kind of resistant to frequent fire, and infrequent fire favors other species that do well in shade or are serotinous and build up a big crop of seeds in between fires. So there's a lot of, I think that's a really rich area to look at.
Thank you, Andrew. We've got 3 more hands up. We've only got a couple more minutes, but we've got Mark Kashowski, Beth Rose Middleton, and Miroslavia as the 3 hands that are up. We do have to have a hard stop at 2 o'clock because we have another meeting with our faculty starting right at 2. But Mark, if you want to quickly ask your question, and Beth Rose and Miroslavia, let's go for it.
Great, thank you. So a quick thing for all of you. I'm glad that Sarah used that fire severity map that I found from David Ackerley. And I'm thinking that you can use that data for focusing research and restoration projects at a more finer detail scale and setting the priority areas. You might also consider seeing if there's older Landsat images that could be used to look at past fires and to look at the comparison of fire severity over time. It's a interesting tool looking at the burn ratio. So that's one idea. The other one for Andrew. Andrew, are you guys using the burned area emergency response methodology at all for comparing some of your sites?
I'm not sure. No, I guess, because I don't know what it is, but yeah.
I think the UC system is actually.
Are we? Okay.
Yeah, there's a standard approach that a lot of CAL FIRE and Forest Service people are using. It's called the BEAR approach. They go in there after fires and use a variety of protocols to evaluate what kind of burn it was. So that's
yes. Okay. So thank you for filling me in. Yes, we did look at that. We looked at a bunch of different rapid post-fire protocols when putting together what we decided to do. But yeah, that's a much more detailed, it's got a lot in there that we haven't been able to do. So it'd be worth looking back.
It's more for just sort of ideas about things to consider and approach.
Yeah.
And then the final one I want to get off real quickly here is I wanted to encourage those of you who don't know about Poudre Creek Council's nursery that has a lot of native plants that are available for restoration after fires. Contact that council to find out how you can get access to their plants for restoration. That's all I had to say.
And they got their seeds from us. Beth Rose, thank you so much for what you put in the chat. We have run out of time, but I am so glad that you're here. Myra, do you want to put your question in the chat and we could write you back directly? Thank you all very much. This has been a great, it's been a great opportunity to update you on all the fires that have occurred. Jeffrey, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, thank you for your participation. And as we've said, we will try to follow up and give you an opportunity to continue the engagement if you're so inclined. Thank you very much for showing up today.
Yeah, thanks. And come on out and look around if you want. Get in touch with us. Thanks.
Thank you all very much. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Ira, I'll make sure to write you back on that. How do you pronounce your name?
Miroslava. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Miroslava. I'll make sure to get back to you. I'll save this chat.
Great. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Take care.
So Sarah, I guess, are we having a separate meeting for the advisory committee?
Yes.
So there's
Yes.
like a separate link?
There's a
link for
separate
that?
link that
Okay.
you should have got from Jeffrey. As soon as I close this one, I'll open that up. And if you're having trouble getting in, let me know and I'll shoot you one. See you
Okay,
guys in a
thanks.
second. Jennifer, we'll see you in a second. Doug?
Could you resend the link to the next meeting, please?
Yes, I will ask Jeffrey to do that right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome. See you soon.